Space investing is booming. Just weeks after SpaceX's record IPO, Bloomberg reports in the private markets, Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin is seeking outside capital for the first time at a roughly $130 billion valuation. Venture investors are also pouring billions into companies betting on the orbital economy. But there's one big bottleneck: launch capacity. Access has been limited, costs have been rising, and getting to space is still hard. Joining us now is Delian Asparouhov, partner at Founders Fund, chairman of Varda Space Industries. Varda also thinking about manufacturing in space. And Del, that's where I wanted to start. What's the latest with Varda? Where are you at?
I think we had a pretty exciting announcement that my co-founder Brewery came on for about a month and a half ago. We announced the first ever commercial space manufacturing partnership with United Therapeutics. United Therapeutics is a $25 billion publicly traded company. They make compounds that are treated for rare pulmonary disorders, think things that affect your lungs. They announced a deal with Varda where we're going to be working on 10 different drug products with them, where we're going to be taking them up to space, improving basically how that drug gets administered to patients and bringing them back down here on Earth. So think a patient that can now take something that used to be a oral tablet, and instead they make it into something that's an inhalable. And so now it's much more efficacious, is a much simpler experience for the patient. And the patient is not thinking about like, oh, this is a space drug. They just pick it up from their pharmacy, and one step in the supply chain happened to be in space.
Capital's flowing into space, but like more specifically, both as an investor, Del, and as a founder and leader of a space startup, how would you sort of describe the asset class that is the orbital space economy?
Yeah, I think what people are waking up to is that the space economy can influence many different aspects of the economy down here on Earth at a truly massive scale, right? We've seen, call it the first generation of the space economy, telecommunications and Earth observation, become quite large, right? Starlink is effectively now one of the most dominant telecommunications companies on the planet. That I would describe as like generation one, and it was enabled over the past couple of years, especially by the reusable orbital rockets that SpaceX built that were effectively the railroad to space. I think a lot of investors now are thinking about what is that next generation of the space economy that is now no longer defined just by what we're doing up in space, but what is that value that is brought down here on Earth? And that requires two ways of a railroad, right? You need the railroad that takes you up to space with the rockets, but you do also need to start to build the railroads that take you back down to Earth. And that's a lot of what we build at Varda for our own use cases, our reentry, sort of vehicles. As investors, we're also really studying the broader supply chain to enable the space economy that are all the subcomponents that are down here on Earth. Ed, we've spoken before about one of my portfolio companies based out in Bulgaria, Endurosat. They build satellite components for a lot of major U.S. companies where, the U.S. company may be the system integrator and the mission operator, but they're building the underlying GPS chips, the solar panels, the satellite components. Another one that's come on your show recently that's doing quite well, Hadrian. They basically operate these automated factory facilities where they build a lot of the parts that go into a SpaceX rocket, an Anduril drone, a Varda capsule, and they just announced a huge deal with the Navy. So you're seeing just all these tailwinds. SpaceX is obviously the sort of leading sort of company in the space, but you're seeing tailwinds, and that's just showing up in Rocket Lab now being a $70 billion company. Hadrian, having a ton of sort of momentum. Impulse Space. There's just like a whole suite of logos that are doing quite well.
We're showing pictures of the view from the Varda capsule in space, right? And what you were just talking about is the bit of most interest with a future orbital economy. It's bringing the payload back to Earth. Of course, SpaceX has just demonstrated Starfall. How much of a disruption is that for Varda? How much is a boost for Varda seeing SpaceX look at a similar plan, a similar piece of technology?
Yeah, I've had a lot of people ask me, whether or not we see this as hugely disruptive. And honestly, counterintuitively, I've mostly seen it as a huge tailwind. Why? One, in the SpaceX S1, they listed orbital manufacturing of pharmaceuticals as a use case that they wanted to pursue. Two, we have had to rely on only our own internal railroad back down from space, versus now SpaceX entering that market validates the value of that railroad and honestly offers me also potentially an alternative supply. In 2029, when I'm going out and doing a super large manufacturing campaign for a pharmaceutical trial, there's a world where my own internal railroads might not give me enough supply, and now I have an alternative in SpaceX. And at the end of the day, SpaceX is just building that capsule. They're just building that reentry platform that brings things back down. if you look at why United Therapeutics is working with Varda, it is not just because we provide that railroad back down. There's the whole pharmaceutical platform around that. How does microgravity affect their particular drug? What is the regulatory approval, and how do we get the FDA on board with that? The pharmaceutical processing equipment. How do you actually take the drug that they make, process it in microgravity in a way that allows it to be an inhalable? And so fundamentally, Varda provides this whole pharmaceutical platform where one aspect of it is this railroad. And now you're telling me I have the largest company on the planet validating the value of that railroad and offering me an alternative supply and marketing my business model through their S1 and through their sort of tweets online. All I can say is that has validated it with our customers, our investors, and it's provided a ton of momentum here at Varda. And so God bless Elon Musk, and God bless Starfall.
We are kind of doing this in reverse, but I wanted to talk about launch. I said at the top, launch has been a bottleneck. What I see is Falcon 9 rideshare capacity tightening, and then there's the transition to Starship, right? You guys have relied on SpaceX to get to orbit. Reflect on that experience and what you see in the market for launch.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that, in this current moment where launch is starting to become constrained, Varda is a very scaled entity. We have our launches booked for all of our internal capacity needs fully through Q1, Q2, 2029. So it's not something that, provides us a ton of immediate concern. In that time frame, for sure, we're obviously working with our, sort of partners at SpaceX, understanding what does that potential transition to Starship look like? What do the future Falcon 9 rideshare, basically payloads start to, sort of look like in that later time frame? And over that time frame, while it's been a very constrained field, with really SpaceX being the only player that is, sort of reliable, low cost, consistent cadence, and obviously, certain other players have had some setbacks over the, sort of past year, I do think by 2029, between Rocket Lab now being a $70 billion company and investors really wanting them to deliver on Neutron, Bezos clearly taking Blue Origin very seriously, and while they've had their setbacks with New Glenn, I do believe that rocket will get back online, and they have shown reusability, right? They are the only people on the planet, other than SpaceX, that have shown their ability to go land a stage 1 and go reuse it. And Stoke Space as well, and there's a handful of others behind them.
We just have 30 seconds. I want to talk reentry. The US looking at offshore sites outside the US, how it goes with that relationship to get reentry approvals, real quick.
Yeah, for now, we're landing all of our capsules out in Australia. Starfall, they just landed off the, sort of coast of the United States in an ocean. At the end of the day, in order to make this railroad back to space super consistent, we're going to have to find an area in the United States that the FAA basically designates as the reentry railroad landing area. We're working with our, sort of regulators and partners here in the United States to find a path back. For now, we're still planning on landing in Australia. Turns out the West Australian desert, super empty, great for reentering vehicles. But it's obviously not the ideal long-term path. U.S. companies should launch from the U.S. and land in the U.S.